Let's face it, wrestling is a pretty murky business, and a lot of wrestlers have done a lot of pretty terrible things. Really, people in general can be rather awful, and wrestlers are like people on steroids. Even though they may have at times played the heroic babyface, the person behind the persona can actually be quite a nasty piece of work, as unlikable off-screen as they are likable on it. Before we get going, these entries are in no specific order. I don't really fancy ranking just how big an arsehole each of these people can be. I'm Adam Pacitti from Cultaholic Wrestling, and these are 10 wrestling babyfaces that turned out to be real-life heels. Join us. Hulk Hogan. When it comes to professional wrestling babyfaces, few have been as over for as long as Hulk Hogan was. The Hulkster exploded in the mid-1980s and never looked back, waving the US flag while preaching the benefits of saying your prayers and taking your vitamins. Sorry, vitamins. Inside the ring, Hogan had an undeniable charisma and knew exactly how to sell and make a red-hot comeback, while his promos couldn't help but make you feel all jacked up, brother. Perhaps it's no surprise that a man who has lived in a world of make-believe for so long has had trouble separating fantasy from reality, with Terry Bollea's long list of lies stretching from the absurd to the downright harmful. Hogan has also been accused of trying to sabotage the careers of others to protect his own main event spot, and generally treating anyone but those in his inner circle with contempt. And then, of course, there was the racism scandal from 2015, which broke the hearts of wrestlers and fans and got the red and yellow menace temporarily removed from WWE's Hall of Fame. Hulk Hogan played a large part in changing the wrestling business for the better, yes, but he does not come without his fair share of baggage. And I'm not talking about Brutus the Barber Beefcake. Sunny. Tamara Sitch broke the mold when, as Sunny, she became arguably the first proper WWE diva. Adored for her girl-next-door good looks and charm, Sunny went from a heel manager to a coveted all-around television personality. AOL's most downloaded celebrity of 1996 was a huge star during the Attitude Era and cultivated an adoring fan base who very much knew that they wanted her. In her personal life, however, Sitch struggled with drug and alcohol addiction, and certainly in her later years as she moved further away from the spotlight, made some very questionable comments and reckless decisions. Chief among them were the various times she decided to get behind the wheel of a vehicle and drive while intoxicated. Sunny racked up multiple DUIs and even spent time in jail for her offenses, but it seemingly never deterred her. Then, tragically, on March 25th, 2022, she once again got drunk, got in her car and hit the gas, only this time her actions had fatal consequences as she collided with a stationary vehicle at a stoplight, killing 75-year-old Julian Lasseter. Sitch, who was almost over 4 times the legal limit at the time of the accident, was ultimately sentenced to 17.5 years in prison. The Ultimate Warrior. WWE may have tried to soften his image with a view to preserving a positive legacy for their former world champion, but make no mistake about it, Jim the Ultimate Warrior Hellwig was a very problematic individual that few in the professional wrestling industry had a nice word to say about. As well as being self-serving and hard to deal with as a performer, Warrior also did little to endear himself to the millions of young fans who idolized him. In his autobiography, Bret Hart recalled Warrior ignoring a Make-A-Wish child who had been waiting for hours in an arena hallway and wanted nothing more than to meet his hero. As well as letting down the little warriors who cheered him on as he sprinted to the ring, Hellwig turned many adults who would have been childhood fans against him with his vitriolic rantings and ravings once his wrestling days were over. As well as making racist and homophobic remarks during a speaking engagement at the University of Connecticut, Warrior also seemed to delight in the plight of the cancer-stricken Bobby the Brain Heenan. An iconic character, perhaps, but the man underneath the face paint evidently left a lot to be desired. The Dynamite Kid. Tom Billington was a revolutionary force of nature between the ropes, perfecting a hybrid style of brawling, high-flying, and technical wrestling that was years ahead of its time. As a member of the WWF roster, he was one half of the tremendously popular British Bulldogs tag team alongside cousin Davey Boy Smith, while over in Japan he was lionized for his series of legendary battles with the original Tiger Mask. Away from the ring, however, Billington was characterized as a bitter and broken individual who seemed to enjoy bullying and tormenting others. As well as hazing and scrapping with his fellow wrestlers, Dynamite reportedly terrorized his wife Michelle with physical and psychological abuse, including allegedly waking her up with a shotgun pointed at her head while threatening that one day it will be loaded. Billington was not shy about the bad he did and didn't try and hide the fact that he could be a scary menace, documenting much of his wickedness in his own autobiography. The Dynamite Kid ended up paying a dear physical and emotional cost for the choices he made in both his career and personal life. Lex Luger. When Lex Luger was crisscrossing across the United States in his Lex Express tour bus in the summer of 1993, shaking hands and kissing babies and waving the American flag with pride, he looked every bit the next patriotic uber babyface in the making. However, the picture painted of a heroic family man who loved his fans was a distorted one. Because for the longest time in real life, Lawrence Foal was a self-centered narcissist who alienated his colleagues while heading on a downward spiral that almost cost him his life. Elizabeth Hewlett, better known as Miss Elizabeth, was drawn into the Total Package's orbit, and unfortunately, their toxic romance led to tragedy. On April 19, 2003, police were called to the townhouse the two shared in Atlanta, Georgia, responding to reports of a domestic disturbance. Hewlett had 2 black eyes, a split lip, and knots on her forehead. Luger was arrested for misdemeanor battery and released on bond. Though they had evidently reconciled and were living together again, Hewlett died of acute toxicity due to a combination of drugs and alcohol in their home on May 1st at the age of just 42. It was Luger, a man who thankfully had turned his life around since finding the Lord, that made the 911 call. Buck Zumhofe. There are bad people in wrestling, there are scumbags in wrestling, there are irredeemable people in wrestling. And then there is Buck Zumhofe. Rock and Roll Buck Zumhofe was a journeyman wrestler who worked for various territories in the 1970s and 80s, most prominently the AWA, before becoming a jobber later on. Triple H even has the misfortune of having his televised WWE debut being a squash match victory over the wrong'un. Despite being charged for heinous crimes involving minors on 2 separate occasions in the 80s for which he was sent to prison, Zumhofe continued to work and even ran his own promotion based around him, Rock and Roll Wrestling, many years later. Arrested once again in 2013, it emerged that Zumhofe had been sadistically and habitually assaulting his own daughter between 1999 and 2011. The county attorney noted that the nature of the crimes was so horrific that they were going to attempt to keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. Though he rather pathetically attempted to flee the courtroom after being found guilty and sentenced to 45 years in prison, Buck was quickly caught and thrown in jail, where he remains today, and I hope they threw away the key. Bob Sweetan. Just look at Bob Sweetan's face. Does that look like a supposed babyface to you? Or does that look like the face of a mean drunk uncle you try to avoid during his yearly Christmas visit? Despite being a villain for most of his career, Bruiser Bob became the top babyface in the Southwest Wrestling territory, which he was also the head booker of, thanks to fans going wild for his use of the pile driver and having an effective antagonist in Tully Blanchard to work opposite. Known within the business as a truly miserable human being, Bob was a noted locker room thief and relentless bully who, in the words of his own ex-wife, was a waste of skin. His former spouse had every right to hold a grudge and speak ill of her one-time husband, considering the various forms of unspeakable abuse he put her and their children through. After he had done torturing his family, he up and abandoned them by shacking up with a Mid-South wrestling groupie who supplied the roster with drugs. A major substance abuser himself, Sweetan left the business, was deported to his native Canada, and lived in relative obscurity for years before passing away in a nursing home at the age of 76. Alberto Del Rio. As the son of Dos Caras and the nephew of Mil Mascaras, Jose Alberto Rodriguez was a member of Lucha Libre royalty. Unlike his family, the man who first performed as Dos Caras Jr. wrestled primarily as a technico or babyface in his native country. Though he predominantly worked as a heel during his WWE run as Alberto Del Rio, the so-called Pride of Mexico also had notable runs as a good guy and continued to work as a babyface once he had left Vince McMahon's employ. Away from the squared circle, however, the former WWE champion's personal life has been marred by controversy and very serious allegations. His one-time fiancée and fellow former WWE star Paige has been very open about the abuse she says she suffered at Alberto's hands. Their tumultuous relationship is best remembered for the various unsavory public scenes the couple caused. Years after breaking up with Paige, Del Rio was arrested in 2020 and leveled with some very grim charges for a purported attempted kidnapping and assault of his new fiancée. The charges were eventually dismissed just days ahead of a scheduled trial after a witness failed to show up in court. Jimmy Snuka. Before the arrival of Hulk Hogan and the explosion of Hulkamania, Jimmy Snuka was pretty much the WWF's top babyface hero. Snuka was wildly popular, and his high-flying exploits helped inspire not only millions of regular fans, but also future wrestling legends like Mick Foley, who famously hitchhiked to Madison Square Garden and witnessed the iconic Superfly splash off the top of the cage onto Don Morocco in person. However, all was not as it seemed in the life of the barefoot brawler. On May 10th, 1983, Snuka's on-the-road girlfriend, Nancy Argentino, was found injured and unresponsive in their hotel room. She was transported to a local hospital where she succumbed to her injuries and sadly passed away. Snuka, who denied any wrongdoing beyond saying that they were fooling around and that Argentino fell and accidentally hit her head, was the only suspect in her death, though no charges were filed at the time and he continued to wrestle as normal. 32 years after Nancy's death, however, Snuka was arrested and charged with third-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter. The WWE Hall of Famer was ultimately determined to be physically and mentally unfit to stand trial and passed away aged 73, 12 days after a judge dismissed him. Chris Benoit. When it came to the art of professional wrestling, there were few who could match the artistry of Chris Benoit. Benoit was a universally respected and ultra-intense performer who produced countless classics for New Japan Pro Wrestling, WCW, and WWE. Away from the canvas, however, this spandex-clad Rembrandt was a Jekyll and Hyde figure who turned out to be one of the industry's greatest monsters. Even taking away his role as the perpetrator in the tragedy that took the lives of his wife Nancy and son Daniel, as well as his own, Benoit was described by many as somebody who could be a locker room bully that enjoyed hazing newcomers. The Miz, Chad Wicks, Matt Striker, and Justin Roberts have all spoken publicly about the poor treatment they received from the Rabid Wolverine when they were members of the SmackDown brand in the mid-2000s. At the time, Benoit's behavior was unfortunately standard practice, and what he, JBL, Bob Holly, and other so-called locker room leaders did was simply viewed as necessary enforcement. Meanwhile, at home, there were warning signs in his marriage with Nancy, who in 2003 filed a restraining order and threatened to divorce him after bouts of domestic abuse left her fearing for her safety.